Hello everyone, my name is Jason Soroko. I'm the CTO for PKI at 6ego. And today in this presentation, we're going to be talking about zero trust architecture and the principles behind zero trust. This is something that you've probably heard about in your daily readings of marketing technical journalism, and you might have wondered what it really means. What kind of product is actually being sold to you here? What kind of changes do you have to make to your network, none of which are easy decisions to make? I'm going to try and break down for you what the principles really are and why they're really important in a modern enterprise network. One of the biggest problems made in network architecture in the past is an assumption, and that assumption was always that everything that's behind your firewall, everything that you would consider part of your private enterprise network, is somehow safer than the hostile public internet. That fundamentally flawed idea has been the bane of the existence of a lot of enterprise network security defenders for the past many years, and unfortunately has been to the benefit of the attackers. What the attackers have taught us is that getting behind that firewall and being able to establish themselves maliciously on nodes within your enterprise network is something that the attackers have always had advantages in being able to do. We've been taught this through the means of social engineering, which unfortunately we're all vulnerable to. And even very recently, we've seen a lot of examples of vulnerabilities on appliances within network enterprises that have led to attackers being able to perpetuate themselves on important nodes within your enterprise network. The end result of thinking that traffic within your enterprise network is somehow safer than the public internet has led us to have less security measures, less security controls within the enterprise network. Therefore, there's simply too much trust. Quite often, when nodes within your enterprise network receive a command, they simply follow it, making the assumption that any command that would be received by the node is somehow legitimate because it's behind the firewall. It's simply not true. It's a bad assumption, and it's the basis for zero trust network architecture. Now, what's the solution to this? There's actually a number of solutions to this. But the main principle to keep in mind is that you should treat your own enterprise network that's behind a firewall as hostile, potentially, as the public internet. One very important way of dealing with that is to use the concept of digital identities to make sure that everything knows where its commands are coming from, in a basic sense. That means making sure everything is authenticated, or to be perhaps more accurate, everything is mutually authenticated. And in order to have authentication, you need to have digital identities. And one form of digital identities that's been around for over 30 years are PKI certificates. Those certificates enable secure authentication within your enterprise network and even outside of your enterprise network. Bringing digital identities to be a core part of your network architecture and a core part of your security mechanisms overall within your enterprise can make a big difference to making life finally harder for the bad guys and a lot easier for your enterprise defenders. So it's not just me saying this. This has actually also been reported within the Zero Trust Architecture Guidance from NIST. So that set of standards published back in February 2020 describes PKI as an essential foundational component of zero trust architecture. And Gartner, the analyst company, has said, in a world of cloud-based users and devices accessing public cloud-based services, the relevance of the legacy enterprise perimeter declines. Identity is the new perimeter. So in both of these quotes, what becomes clear is that digital identities are important to new ideas within network enterprise architecture. And the underlying concept that's important to note is that devices really should be authenticating to one another rather than merely trusting each other with either very weak forms of authentication or no authentication at all. Obviously, when you have a lot of digital identities that you need to manage, you need help to be able to automate the provisioning and the management of those digital identities. PKI has been at the center of that kind of automation and management for over 30 years and remains an essential part of your enterprise security toolset. So for some of you, this might sound like an old idea coming back to the forefront, and that's probably very true. And that old idea is the principle of least privileges. Basically, what it means is that you should apply the minimum level of access required to perform a function. Unfortunately, due to all the complexity within an enterprise, typically a lot of users and devices are overprivileged. And that's due to the fact that it takes work to be able to determine what the minimum level of access is in order to get a job done. Unfortunately, the bad guys have taken advantage of that overprivilege. And that's especially true once the bad guy has gained a foothold inside of the enterprise network. But what I'd like to argue is that once you actually have done the work of applying a minimum level of access to a credential, that yields enormous returns because it reduces the attack surface in a massive way. It then is an expression of your compliance and auditing. And because of the fact that credentials are harder to steal, or even once they're stolen, the ability to do malicious things with those credentials is minimized, it stops the spread of malware and the spread of the capabilities of the malicious actors within your enterprise network. That means less lateral movements from node to node maliciously, and the less chance of persistence of the bad guy within your network. So as I said before, one of the means of achieving zero trust within your enterprise network is to have strong authentication between all entities or all nodes. Essentially, everything connecting to everything else should be able to assert who it is in both directions. We call that authentication, or if it happens in the case of both entities being able to talk to each other and assert who each other is, we call that mutual authentication. When you're talking about human-based authentication to a service, we've seen a lot of multi-factor authentication over the years, and that's been positioned as an improvement over traditional passwords, but that really only works and really only has value when you're talking about a use case between humans and devices. And even the usability of multi-factor authentication over the years hasn't improved a lot. Now, there's a wide spectrum of security strength between multi-factor authentication credential form factors. But what I'd like to argue is that really strong authentication between servers, applications, containers, and even people themselves requires certificates. And those certificates take the place of weaker forms of multi-factor authentication. It leads to a better user experience. And in the case of those non-human interactions that can't take advantage of multi-factor authentication, it creates the means of strong authentication for those entities. So by mandating this higher level authentication between all entities, we greatly reduce the attack surface. And we eliminate the dependence on passwords, which can be cracked, guessed, exfiltrated, or just inherently be weak. You don't have that kind of problem with certificates, especially in the day and age when those forms of digital identity can be stored inside of secure enclaves, HSMs, and those can take the form of chipsets that are on your laptop, on your smart device, and even on your IoT devices. So things have come a long way. We no longer have to rely on hard-coded passwords on headless devices, or forcing users to have a combination of remembering a weak password as well as an MFA credential form factor. PKI certificates are simply a better solution in every case. So what's different here? What recently happened that should really make you think twice about treating your enterprise network with too much trust? Why should you now start to really scrutinize the level of trust and the level of privileges that you allow within your corporate network? Well, I think that a couple of recent events really help to illustrate what the attackers have been teaching us. The Microsoft Exchange attack was due to a vulnerability in on-premise based Microsoft Exchange servers. I think there's still a lot of CIOs and CISOs in the world today that believe that Microsoft Exchange hosted in the cloud, let's say Azure, is not as secure as having the server within your enterprise network. You might be thinking, I've got all kinds of security controls within my enterprise network. I've got a firewall, and I've got a whole staff of people who obsess over security, and we're safe. The problem is, no matter how much investment you've made in your enterprise network, Microsoft Exchange on-premise had vulnerabilities that allowed malicious attackers to get in and then persist. This led to really serious levels of attack, which enabled the bad guys to then laterally move from the vulnerable Microsoft Exchange server to other vulnerable nodes within your enterprise network. Essentially, there was too much trust. Because the Microsoft Exchange server was behind the firewall, CIOs and CISOs trusted it and basically relied on the software to have no vulnerabilities, and that's a bad assumption. It has now led to tens of thousands of enterprises now having to deal with persistent attacks on their enterprise networks. Let's go to another example. SolarWinds had a product which essentially was a security monitoring system in the form factor of an appliance that would sit behind your firewall. And it would presumably protect you from attacks on your enterprise network. Well, just like the Microsoft Exchange server on-premise, this on-premise appliance also had software that had security vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities inherently allowed the attacker to get in, persist itself on that appliance, and then move laterally through the enterprise network from there. And because this was such a trusted device, quite often itself was not as scrutinized as other parts of the network. In fact, I remember an interview with Kevin Mandia on television that I saw. And by the way, Kevin Mandia's organization under FireEye were some of the earliest people, or perhaps the earliest people, to actually report on this attack. And what they had said was they started to see some malicious activity within their enterprise network. They didn't know where it was coming from, so they started to scratch their heads and wonder, where is this attack coming from? Well, these are some of the smartest people in the world to ask that question. And after scratching their heads for at least a few moments, it ended up turning out that it was the SolarWinds appliance that they had been using. So if Kevin Mandia's team had to scratch their heads, what hope is there for the rest of us to be able to determine that an overly trusted appliance within our enterprise network is the source of an attack? And let's not forget this third example of ransomware attacks or any other form of malware attacks that typically come in through social engineering. Yes, your enterprise may have a firewall, but unfortunately the human beings that interact with the rest of the world can be socially engineered. And that social engineering leads to compromised nodes within your enterprise network. So my argument is that all of these attacks could have been mitigated or at least blunted by implementing more forms of zero trust network architecture principles. And in fact, part of that is requiring digital identities for authentication between all systems. So now that we have to assume that our own enterprise networks, those networks that we've held very close to our hearts for many years, we've always trusted them, perhaps a little too much or way too much, how do we incorporate zero trust network architecture principles into our security decision-making for the future? Well, let's consider this. We're dealing with a new world. This is no longer just a Microsoft stack of technology world of the 1990s and early 2000s. We're now dealing with a plethora of operating systems, device types, and the number of stacks of technology that we have to deal with, whether they're on-premise or in the cloud or elsewhere, including our own partner networks, is very important. So let's think about it like this. Intellectual property is in a lot of different places, and you have to cross a lot of hostile network boundaries in order to get to it. So your enterprise has this enormously complicated heterogeneous environment where there's no single pane of glass to manage authentication for those machines or those human beings. Well, part of the problem that I've seen is that applying weak forms of old human authentication methods to machines, such as hard coding passwords into those machines, has been a disaster. Things like the Mirai botnet have shown us that. So what's the difference here? What does certificates and certificate management gain within this kind of thinking? Well, X509 certificates are a common approach for both machines and humans. Machines themselves really require the certificates even the most because they don't have an alternative such as a weaker form of MFA. And for human beings themselves, not only is it much stronger than a password plus MFA combination, but it's much easier to use. As well, by having a higher level form of credential form factor, such as certificate, we can apply an abstraction layer of administration that we like to call the single pane of glass for all certificate-based and even all key management that may not be as part of a certificate. We have provisioning technologies so that certificates can be automatically installed wherever they need to be. And certificate-based authentication is just about everywhere. It works with capabilities already present in your applications. It has the additional enormous benefit of essentially acting as a whitelist for your devices. In other words, only authorized devices that have been provisioned can actually access your intellectual property, access your Wi-Fi networks, etc. Additionally, It's not just about authentication. It's also about encryption and also digital signatures. Once you've been provisioned with certificates, you're able to perform these other important functions. And you've heard a lot about passwordless single sign-on. Certificates are at the center of that technology as well. So in other words, just like NIST said in their standards on zero trust network architecture, PKI and digital certificates can be foundational to implementing the principles of least privileges, also known as zero trust network architecture. The beauty to all this is that you don't have to boil the ocean. You can choose parts of your network where your crown jewels are present and apply security controls where they're needed the most, and then move laterally across your network to other lower risk nodes and intellectual property. So there's a lot of places you could start, but I think digital identities and the whole idea of authentication within your enterprise network is the right place to start. In other words, let's think about user authentication, something that's often called passwordless. It potentially could have the biggest impact for most enterprises. Certificate-based authentication not only eliminates passwords and reduces IT overhead, but because of the new provisioning technologies, you can have much more rapid user adoption. That's really important in times of remote work, which of course is exploding right now. We're going to talk about that more in a moment. But if you build this out gradually, reducing the threat exposure, it's a good idea to identify key server and application interactions and replace weaker forms of credentials with certificates. What a great time to start applying your governance by defining a policy for certificate lifecycle management. And you'll find that this explosion in digital identities is going to require automation and certificate management. So therefore, investing in a single pane of glass for all of your certificate resources is really important. Then, once you've gotten that far, consider some legacy systems that are not capable of supporting certificate-based authentication. Remember, those are going to be some of the systems now that the bad guys are going to look at to start targeting. Is it time to deprecate? And then you can start making decisions if you need to keep those legacy systems. There are other forms of network isolation technologies and policy management technologies that are out there right now that can help you. Does anybody listening to this remember the time of hard tokens for authentication? I'm sure you do. Some of you probably still use them to this day. And my goodness, what a pain. But not just for the people who use them, it's also for the people who have to provision them. Of course, back in the day before the pandemic, it used to be a situation where you might have needed a few every month. Goodness only knows, maybe a lot. But certainly with the pandemic, there was a situation where you might have had your entire workforce having to work remotely. So you had to drop ship all of these hard tokens out to your employees. And I'll tell you something, I read online a number of organizations that struggled with this massively. But the same was true for any of the other forms of multi-factor authentication as well. Any form of one-time passcode forms of authentication augmenting passwords. Even if you had to provision soft tokens onto mobile devices, which is of course a lot easier to use, there were still all kinds of problems with provisioning these things. Well, why not use an authenticator where the provisioning technology is a lot more robust and doesn't involve passwords at all, which gives you not just much stronger security overall, but also a much better user experience. So, in summary, certificate-based authentication simplifies secure connectivity while improving robustness. It's hard to ignore this time post-pandemic, where the challenges that we had before are the same as we have now. It's just that the pressures to do this on scales that we've never done before is much greater. I think we've come a long way, especially after having lived for more than a year of time when a lot of our employees and staff were working remotely. It's going to make everything for the better, especially when we consider B2B and B2C considerations as well. So let's conclude this. Zero Trust network architecture principles are here to stay. They might not be called that in the future, but the principles behind them are so important that it doesn't matter what you call it. You're going to have to be implementing it over the years to come. And ZDNA, if you're doing it properly, really does depend on digital identities. Best way to think about that is that every machine, every user is going to require X509 certificates and therefore management of the life cycle of those certificates. What do you get in return? Way more robust security, but as well, the best uptake possible. Probably the easiest user experience there is, especially compared to the username and password world that most of us came from. I want to leave you with this idea, and some of you may have heard this before, but a lot of you probably heard about the Maginot Line, which was a French defensive system employed after World War I. And at the onset of World War II, France had felt quite secure knowing that the Maginot Line was in place to defend themselves against their enemies. They felt that it was a robust, impenetrable defense. It was very easily defended, very easily to get around to, very easy to provision with logistics. Unfortunately, areas north of the Maginot Line, such as the Netherlands and Belgium, were wide open to attack. And so ultimately, as we know from history, the attackers of France merely bypassed that Maginot Line, choosing not to directly attack the strongest defenses, but merely to walk around it. This analogy is so important to understanding zero trust network architecture, because unfortunately, in the example of World War II France, one of the biggest mistakes France made was not just to recognize the fact that the Maginot Line had a big gap, but also the French decided not to defend the internals of France nearly as well as they should have. That's incredibly true for anybody who has set up a firewall within a corporate environment and then chose to trust the internals of the corporate network way too much. Firewalls are fantastic. You wouldn't build a car without doors, and you wouldn't build an enterprise network without a firewall. It's absolutely the case. There's a lot of great technologies that come with it. But the complete dependence on firewalls is inadequate for today's attacks. We've seen that with the vulnerabilities on appliances and important enterprise software, such as Microsoft Exchange, as well as all the other malware attacks that we've seen. Security must exist at every point in the network. In other words, every node. Everything should have an identity. You shouldn't be trusting what's inside your network as much as you have been in the past. There really is no room for complacency here, and the bad guys have taught us a lot about what they're capable of, and unfortunately, I have a strong belief that their technology pipeline is as good or better than any of ours. But by employing zero trust network architecture, we're at least not going to give the bad guys the free lunch that they've had for way too long. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and have a great day.